Hello, and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. The fluorescent lights in the corridor flickered twice before settling into their usual harsh glow, and Mei Lin paused mid-step, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly against the polished hospital floor. It was just past 2 in the morning, and the overnight shift at Queen Mary Hospital had settled into that peculiar quiet that only medical facilities know. A silence punctuated by distant beeping monitors and the occasional groan of old pipes in the walls. She had been a nurse here for nearly 7 years, long enough to know every creak and shadow, long enough to feel comfortable walking these halls alone. But tonight, something felt different. A subtle shift in the air that she couldn't quite name. When she reached the nurses' station on the 3rd floor, she glanced at the patient board and noticed that room 304 showed occupied, a small green light glowing beside the room number. She frowned slightly because she had checked that same board less than an hour ago, and the room had been listed as empty, scheduled for deep cleaning after the previous patient's discharge that afternoon. Mei Lin had grown up in Wan Chai, in one of those cramped apartments where 3 generations lived together, and privacy was a luxury no one could afford. Her grandmother used to tell stories about spirits and hungry ghosts, tales that made young Mei Lin pull the blanket over her head at night. But as she grew older and entered nursing school, she had learned to dismiss such things as superstition. Medicine was concrete, observable, provable. Bodies were machines that could be repaired or maintained, and when they failed, there were logical reasons backed by science and data. She had chosen nursing not out of some grand calling, but because it offered stability and respect, a way to lift herself and eventually help her family. Queen Mary Hospital was one of the oldest and most prestigious medical facilities in Hong Kong. Perched on a hillside overlooking the harbor, its aging structure, a maze of corridors that had been expanded and renovated countless times over the decades. The 3rd floor housed the general medical ward, mostly elderly patients recovering from surgeries or managing chronic conditions. During the day, the ward buzzed with activity, doctors making rounds, family members visiting with bags of fruit and homemade soup, physical therapists guiding patients down the hallway. But at night, especially during the graveyard shift, from midnight to 8 in the morning, the ward transformed into something else entirely. The lights were dimmed to let patients sleep, and the nursing staff was reduced to just 2 or 3 people responsible for monitoring dozens of rooms. Mei Lin usually worked with another nurse named Jenny, and occasionally a nursing assistant if they were lucky. But tonight Jenny had called in sick, leaving Mei Lin to cover the entire floor alone, until a replacement could arrive around 4. She didn't mind the solitude most nights. It gave her time to catch up on charting, to move through her tasks methodically without the constant interruptions that came with daytime shifts. She had always been efficient, perhaps too efficient according to some of her colleagues who thought she lacked warmth. But Mei Lin believed that competence mattered more than bedside manner when it came to keeping patients alive. She approached room 304 slowly, her hand resting on the metal chart holder attached to the door. Through the small rectangular window, she could see the bed clearly, and there was definitely someone in it. The shape was unmistakable, a figure lying on its back, beneath the white hospital sheets, completely still. The heart monitor beside the bed displayed a steady rhythm, the green line tracing regular peaks and valleys across the black screen, accompanied by that familiar beeping that marked each heartbeat. Mei Lin felt a flicker of confusion. She was absolutely certain this room had been empty. She had personally checked it during her rounds at 1 o'clock, had even glanced inside to verify that housekeeping had finished their work. The bed had been stripped down to the mattress, the monitors turned off, the entire room sterile and waiting. She pushed open the door, and it swung inward with a soft whoosh of air. The temperature inside the room felt noticeably cooler than the hallway, cool enough that Mei Lin could see her breath forming tiny clouds in front of her face. The patient in the bed remained motionless, the sheets pulled up high enough that she couldn't see the face clearly, just a vague outline of a head on the pillow. The heart monitor continued its steady beeping, 72 beats per minute, perfectly regular and unremarkably normal. Mei Lin stepped closer, her eyes scanning for the patient wristband that should have been visible, the identification that every single person admitted to this hospital was required to wear. She reached for the chart at the foot of the bed, but the metal holder was empty. No paperwork, no admission forms, no treatment orders. Her confusion deepened into something closer to unease. She moved to the side of the bed, reaching out to gently touch what she assumed was the patient's shoulder beneath the sheets. Her hand passed through empty air and landed on the mattress. There was nothing there. The sheets lay flat against the bed, draped as if covering a body, but when she pressed down, she felt only the firm surface of the hospital mattress beneath the thin fabric. Mei Lin jerked her hand back, her heart rate accelerating. She grabbed the edge of the sheet and pulled it down, quickly, yanking it toward the foot of the bed. The bed was completely empty. No patient, no body, no explanation for the perfect human-shaped impression in the sheets. But the heart monitor continued beeping steadily, showing vital signs for someone who wasn't there. She stared at the screen, watching the green line trace its path, the numbers displaying blood pressure, oxygen, saturation, respiratory rate, all within normal ranges, all indicating a living, breathing human being. Her training kicked in automatically, the rational part of her brain trying to make sense of this impossibility. Medical equipment malfunctioned all the time. Monitors could pick up electrical interference, display phantom readings if the leads weren't properly disconnected. She reached for the wires that should have been attached to a patient's chest, following them from the monitor to the bed. The electrode pads dangled loose in the air, not connected to anything, yet the monitor showed a perfect cardiac rhythm. Mei Lin felt the temperature in the room drop even further, cold enough now that goosebumps rose along her arms beneath her scrubs. She backed away from the bed slowly, her eyes never leaving the monitor screen. The beeping continued, steady and relentless, marking heartbeats that belonged to no one. She told herself to stay calm, to think logically. There had to be an explanation. Perhaps the monitor was malfunctioning, picking up a signal from another room somehow. Perhaps she was more exhausted than she realized, her mind playing tricks after too many consecutive night shifts. She had worked 4 nights in a row, pulling extra shifts to cover for colleagues, and sleep deprivation could cause hallucinations. Everyone in the medical field knew that. But this didn't feel like a hallucination. The cold was too real, the beeping too clear and distinct. She turned to leave the room, to go back to the nurse's station and call maintenance, or maybe even her supervisor. But as she reached the doorway, the beeping stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the sound had been. She looked back over her shoulder. The monitor screen had gone dark, completely powered off, even though she hadn't touched any buttons. The room seemed darker now, too, the shadows in the corners deeper and more defined. Mei Lin stepped into the hallway and pulled the door closed behind her, her hands trembling slightly as she did so. She stood there for a moment, trying to steady her breathing, telling herself that everything was fine, that there was a logical explanation she simply hadn't discovered yet. When she returned to the nurse's station, she checked the computer system, pulling up the bed management records for the entire third floor. Room 304 was listed as unoccupied, status marked as ready for admission, last patient discharged at 3:15 that afternoon. She scrolled through the admission logs for the past week, looking for any pattern or recent deaths in that particular room. 3 patients had occupied 304 inches the last 7 days, all of them discharged alive to either home or rehabilitation facilities. Nothing unusual in any of their charts, no complications, no incidents. Mei Lin rubbed her eyes, feeling the exhaustion settling into her bones. She considered writing up an incident report about the malfunctioning equipment. But what would she even say? That a monitor showed vital signs for a patient who didn't exist? That she had felt an impossible cold and seen sheets shaped around an invisible body? It sounded absurd even in her own mind. She decided to wait, to see if anything else strange happened during the rest of her shift. She had other patients to check on, medications to administer, charts to update. She couldn't afford to dwell on one bizarre incident, no matter how unsettling it had been. For the next hour, Mei Lin moved through her rounds with mechanical precision, checking on the elderly man in 301 who was recovering from hip surgery, adjusting the IV drip for the woman in 307 who had pneumonia, helping the diabetic patient in 312 to the bathroom. Everything was routine and normal, the familiar rhythms of hospital care that she had performed thousands of times. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck that made her glance over her shoulder repeatedly. Every time she passed room 304, she looked through the small window. The room remained dark and empty, the bed stripped and waiting, exactly as it should be. No mysterious patient, no beeping monitor, no unexplained cold. She began to convince herself that she had imagined the entire thing, that stress and exhaustion had conspired to create a momentary delusion. It was almost 4 a.m. when she returned to the nurse's station to find the replacement nurse, a young woman named Cassandra, finally arriving to help with the rest of the shift. Cassandra was fresh-faced and energetic despite the early hour, chattering about traffic and apologizing for being late. Mei Lin felt a wave of relief at no longer being alone on the floor. They worked together in companionable silence for a while, Cassandra taking over some of the patient care while Mei Lin focused on updating medical charts. It was Cassandra who broke the quiet with a casual question that made Mei Lin's blood run cold. The younger nurse had been checking supply levels in the medication room when she walked back to the station with a puzzled expression. She asked Mei Lin if there was supposed to be a patient in room 304 because she had just walked past and noticed the heart monitor was on, showing what looked like normal vital signs. Mei Lin stood up so quickly her chair rolled backward and hit the wall. She followed Cassandra down the corridor, her legs moving automatically while her mind raced. When they reached 304, both nurses peered through the window. The room was exactly as Mei Lin had seen it hours before, the bed occupied by a shape beneath the sheets, the monitor beside it beeping steadily, displaying vital signs that indicated a healthy, stable patient. Cassandra reached for the door handle, but Mei Lin grabbed her wrist, stopping her. She explained what had happened earlier, how she had pulled back the sheets to find nothing there, how the monitor had been showing readings for a patient who didn't exist. Cassandra's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked like fear mixed with disbelief. Together they entered the room, and again Mei Lin felt that unnatural cold wrapping around her like a physical presence. Cassandra gasped softly, her breath visible in the frigid air. They approached the bed from opposite sides, and this time Mei Lin didn't hesitate. She grabbed the sheets and yanked them completely off the bed in one swift motion. Empty. The mattress lay bare, showing its standard hospital blue waterproof cover, no impression, no wait, no patient. Yet the monitor continued its relentless beeping, the screen displaying a heart rate of 74 beats per minute. Cassandra reached out and touched the empty space where a patient should have been, her hand moving through air and meeting the mattress just as Mei Lin's had. The younger nurse made a small sound of distress, backing away from the bed. She whispered that they needed to get out of the room, her voice shaking. Mei Lin agreed, but as they turned toward the door, they both heard it, a sound that seemed to come from the bed behind them. It was breathing, slow and steady and unmistakably human, the soft inhale and exhale of someone sleeping peacefully. They ran. There was no discussion, no moment of decision. Both nurses simply bolted from the room, the door slamming shut behind them. They stood in the hallway, hearts pounding, staring at each other with wide eyes. Cassandra started to cry quietly, her hands shaking as she tried to wipe her face. Mei Lin felt her own hands trembling, but forced herself to remain outwardly calm. They returned to the nurse's station, and Mei Lin immediately called the nursing supervisor, a stern woman named Mrs. Wang, who had been working at Queen Mary Hospital for over 30 years. Mei Lin explained the situation as clearly as she could, trying to keep her voice level and professional, but even to her own ears it sounded impossible and irrational. Mrs. Wang listened without interrupting, and when Mei Lin finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, the supervisor said she would come up to the 3rd floor immediately. While they waited, neither Mei Lin nor Cassandra spoke. They both kept glancing down the corridor toward room 304, afraid of what they might see. When Mrs. Wang arrived 15 minutes later, she was accompanied by one of the night security guards, a middle-aged man named Mr. Chen. The supervisor's expression was neutral, professionally skeptical, but not dismissive. She asked Mei Lin to show her exactly what had happened. The 4 of them walked to room 304, and through the window they could all see the same impossible scene: the occupied bed, the beeping monitor, the sheets draped over an invisible patient, Mrs. Wang's face went pale, but she pushed open the door and entered the room with the security guard close behind. Mei Lin and Cassandra followed reluctantly. Mrs. Wang approached the bed without hesitation, her years of experience overriding whatever fear she might have felt. She pulled back the sheets, just as Mei Lin had done, revealing the empty mattress beneath. The monitor continued beeping. Mrs. Wang reached behind the machine and unplugged it from the wall outlet. The screen went dark immediately, and the beeping stopped. The sudden silence filled the room like a presence of its own. For several seconds, no one moved. Then, slowly, the monitor screen flickered back to life. The numbers reappeared. The green line resumed its steady tracing of a cardiac rhythm, and the beeping started again, even though the machine was no longer connected to any power source. Mr. Chen, the security guard, made a strangled sound and backed toward the door. Mrs. Wang stared at the monitor, her professional composure finally cracking. She turned to the others and spoke in a low, steady voice. She said they needed to leave the room now, and that she would be locking this room and reporting the situation to hospital administration in the morning. No one needed to be told twice. As they filed out of room 304, Mei Lin was the last to cross the threshold. Just before she stepped into the hallway, she felt it, a pressure against her back as if someone had reached out and touched her through her scrubs, cold fingers pressing between her shoulder blades. She stumbled forward, nearly falling, and when she spun around to look back into the room, she saw something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. For just a fraction of a second, barely long enough to register, she saw a figure sitting upright in the bed, a woman with long black hair hanging over her face, hospital gown hanging loose on a frame too thin to be healthy. Then the image was gone, and the bed was empty again. But the impression of that figure burned into Mei Lin's mind with perfect clarity. Mrs. Wang pulled her into the hallway and closed the door, producing a key from her pocket and locking it with shaking hands. She placed a hand on Mei Lin's shoulder and asked if she was all right. Mei Lin nodded numbly, unable to find words to describe what she had just seen. The supervisor instructed both nurses to complete their shift on a different floor and said that she would handle all the paperwork regarding this incident. She told them not to discuss what had happened with other staff members, that it would only cause unnecessary panic and rumors. Mei Lin agreed automatically, but she knew she would never forget what had occurred in room 304. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. Mei Lin went through the motions of patient care, but her mind kept returning to that glimpse of the figure in the bed, the impossible cold, the monitor that ran without power. When her shift ended at 8 in the morning and she stepped out into the bright Hong Kong sunshine, the normal world felt strange and distant, as if she had crossed some invisible boundary and could never quite return. She took the bus home to her apartment in Wan Chai, exhausted, but unable to sleep. She kept thinking about her grandmother's stories, the ones she had dismissed as superstition and folklore. Perhaps there were things that medicine and science couldn't explain, phenomena that existed in the spaces between what was known and what was possible. Over the following days, Mei Lin learned through the hospital grapevine that room 304 had been taken out of service indefinitely, officially listed as requiring structural repairs, though no construction work ever began. Other nurses who had worked the night shift mentioned strange occurrences on the third floor, always speaking in hushed tones, always careful not to be overheard by supervisors. A nursing assistant claimed she had heard crying coming from behind the locked door of 304. An orderly said he had seen a woman in a hospital gown standing at the end of the third-floor hallway at 3 in the morning, but when he approached, she vanished. Mei Lin never spoke about her experience, but she requested a transfer to the day shift and never worked overnight at Queen Mary Hospital again. Years later, she would occasionally research the history of the hospital, looking for explanations or patterns. She discovered that the building had been constructed in phases, with the oldest sections dating back to the early 20th century. During the Japanese occupation in World War II, the hospital had been used as a military facility, and many people had died within its walls. The third floor, according to some records, had once housed a psychiatric unit before being converted to general medicine. But Mei Lin never found a specific story that explained what she had experienced in room 304, no tragic death or restless spirit that matched the figure she had glimpsed. Perhaps some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved, some phenomena beyond the reach of rational explanation. What she did know, with absolute certainty, was that something had been in that room with her, something that existed in a space between life and death, presence and absence, something that the monitors could detect even when human eyes saw nothing. And on quiet nights, when she couldn't sleep, she would sometimes wonder if it was still there, waiting in the darkness of room 304, lying in a bed that would forever appear occupied to those who looked closely enough. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But the hospital ward was not the only place in Hong Kong where the boundary between the living and the dead seemed impossibly thin. In the abandoned corridors of old government buildings, where shadows stretched long after the lights went out and footsteps echoed in empty hallways, another person would discover that some presences refused to remain unseen. What happened during one security guard's routine patrol would prove that sometimes the most terrifying encounters are the ones captured on camera, preserved in digital memory as proof that we are never truly alone, even when we think we are. The government building stood in Sheung Wan, 7 stories of pale, concrete, and narrow windows that dated back to the 1970s. A relic of Hong Kong's rapid expansion when such structures were thrown up quickly to house the administrative machinery of a growing city. It had been decommissioned 3 years ago, its offices emptied, and its functions transferred to newer, more efficient facilities in Kowloon. Now it sat in bureaucratic limbo, waiting for demolition or renovation, the kind of decision that could take years to finalize while the building itself slowly deteriorated. The ground floor and basement remained occupied by a small security company contracted to prevent vandalism and illegal occupation, but the upper 6 floors stood empty, stripped of furniture and equipment, just bare rooms and long corridors lit by emergency lighting that stayed on all night. Wong Tai-kit had been working security for 15 years, starting as a young man fresh from secondary school, with no particular skills or ambitions, content to take a job that required little more than showing up and staying awake. He was 42 now, divorced, living alone in a subdivided flat in Sham Shui Po. His life settled into routines that varied little from week to week. The security company assigned him to the old government building 6 months ago, and he found he actually preferred it to the luxury residential towers or shopping centers he had guarded previously. There were no demanding residents complaining about noise or suspicious visitors, no crowds of shoppers to monitor, no real expectation of anything happening at all. His job consisted primarily of walking through the building twice per shift, checking that doors remained locked and windows unbroken, and spending the rest of his time in the small security office in the basement watching television or sleeping. The pay was modest but adequate, and the solitude suited him. Wong had always been a quiet man, more comfortable with his own company than making small talk with colleagues or residents. His co-workers on the day shift sometimes joked that he was like a ghost himself, appearing silently and disappearing just as quietly when his 12-hour shift ended at 6 a.m. He didn't mind the teasing. He had learned long ago that life was easier when you kept your head down and didn't draw attention to yourself. The building had a strange atmosphere, especially at night when the streets outside went quiet, and the only sounds were the occasional car passing or the distant wail of a siren. The fluorescent lights in the corridors buzzed constantly, that electrical hum that most people learned to ignore, but that became almost deafening in the silence of 3 a.m. The walls were painted institutional beige, marked here and there with dark rectangles where photographs or notices had once hung. The floors were scuffed linoleum, cracked in places, stained by decades of foot traffic. Wong's patrol route took him from the basement up through each floor systematically, checking doors and windows, his flashlight cutting through the shadows in rooms where the emergency lighting didn't quite reach. He had done this walk so many times that he no longer needed to think about it, his feet carrying him automatically through the maze of corridors and stairwells. He usually started his patrol at midnight and again at 4 a.m, each round taking about 40 minutes if he moved at a steady pace. Tonight was a Thursday, the 20th of October, unseasonably warm and humid even at night, the kind of weather that made shirts stick to skin and left a thin film of sweat on everything. Wong had started his midnight patrol right on schedule, climbing the stairs from the basement to the ground floor and working his way up. The building was laid out simply, each floor divided into offices on either side of a central corridor that ran the length of the structure. Most of the office doors stood open, revealing empty rooms with nothing but dusty floors and the occasional piece of forgotten furniture pushed against a wall. The windows looked out over the narrow streets of Sheung Wan, the neon signs of late-night restaurants, and the darkened shop fronts closed for the evening. By the time Wang reached the 4th floor, he had settled into that half-aware state that came from performing the same task night after night, his mind wandering while his body went through the motions. He was thinking about whether to stop at the convenience store on his way home to buy breakfast, debating between instant noodles or a pork bun, when he heard the footsteps behind him. They were distinct and clear. The sound of shoes against linoleum. The same rhythm as his own footsteps, but just slightly delayed. An echo that shouldn't have existed in the empty corridor. Wang stopped walking immediately, and the footsteps behind him stopped as well. He stood perfectly still, listening intently, his heartbeat suddenly loud in his ears. The building made noises all the time, the settling of old concrete, the creaking of pipes, the buzz of lights. But this had been different. This had sounded exactly like someone walking behind him, matching his pace step for step. He told himself it was just an acoustic trick, sound bouncing off the walls in strange ways, his own footsteps reflecting back to him. He started walking again, moving slowly down the corridor toward the stairwell at the far end. The footsteps resumed behind him, maintaining the same distance, neither getting closer nor falling behind. Wang felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up, that primal response to unseen danger that no amount of rationalization could suppress. He spun around quickly, his flashlight beam sweeping across the empty corridor. There was nothing there, just the long hallway stretching back toward the stairs he had come up, the open office doors on either side, the pale walls and flickering fluorescent lights. He called out, his voice sounding strange and too loud in the silence, asking if anyone was there. No response came, just the echo of his own words fading into the empty spaces. He stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, trying to calm the surge of adrenaline that had flooded his system. He was alone. He had to be alone. The building was locked, all entrances secured. No way for anyone to get in without triggering the alarms or being seen on the security cameras. But the thought of the cameras made him remember something important. There were CCTV cameras throughout the building, covering all the main corridors and stairwells, all of them feeding to the digital recorder in the security office. If someone was actually following him, the cameras would have caught it. Wang decided to continue his patrol quickly, moving through the remaining floors with considerably more speed than usual, his nerves on edge and his flashlight constantly sweeping the shadows. The footsteps continued intermittently, sometimes there and sometimes not, always just behind him, always stopping when he stopped. By the time he reached the 7th floor, the top of the building, he was nearly running. He checked the last few rooms perfunctorily, his attention focused more on the sounds behind him than on the actual security check. When he finally reached the stairwell to head back down, he paused at the top of the stairs and looked back one more time. The 7th floor corridor stretched away from him, empty and still, but he could have sworn he saw movement at the far end, a flicker of white disappearing around the corner. His hand tightened on the flashlight, and he forced himself to take several deep breaths. He was letting his imagination run wild, letting the isolation and darkness play tricks on his mind. There was nothing in this building but him and his own paranoia. He descended the stairs rapidly, his footsteps echoing loudly in the concrete stairwell, and he didn't slow down until he reached the basement and pushed through the metal door into the security office. The office was small and windowless, dominated by a desk holding 4 monitors that displayed camera feeds from throughout the building. There was a microwave in the corner, a small refrigerator, a cot where Wang sometimes napped during quiet hours, and a swivel chair that squeaked when he sat down heavily. His hands were shaking slightly, and he felt foolish for being so rattled by what was probably nothing more than acoustic phenomena and an overactive imagination. He looked at the monitors, watching the static feeds from various corridors, all of them showing exactly what he expected to see: empty hallways, closed doors, nothing moving. He rewound the digital recorder, searching for the footage from his patrol on the 4th floor, the section where he had first heard the footsteps clearly. The timestamp showed 12:17 a.m. when he entered the 4th floor corridor from the stairwell. On the screen, he watched himself walk into frame, his figure small and slightly distorted by the wide-angle lens. He moved down the corridor at a steady pace, his flashlight visible as he swept it through open doorways. Everything looked normal. Then, about 10 seconds after he passed beneath the camera, something else entered the frame. Wang leaned closer to the monitor, his heart beginning to pound again. A figure appeared at the edge of the screen, following the same path he had taken. It was a woman, dressed in white, her long black hair hanging loose past her shoulders. She moved with a strange, gliding quality, her feet seeming not to quite touch the floor properly. The image quality wasn't perfect, the lighting in the corridor creating shadows that made details difficult to discern, but there was no question that someone else had been in that corridor with him. Wang watched as the figure followed him down the hallway, maintaining a distance of perhaps 10 or 15 feet, always staying just behind him. When he stopped on the recording, she stopped as well. When he turned around with his flashlight, the figure simply stood there, but the light from his flashlight seemed to pass through her rather than illuminating her features. He could see the wall behind her through her body, as if she were translucent, not quite solid. Wang felt ice flood his veins. He continued watching the footage, his mouth dry, as his recorded self finished checking the 4th floor and moved toward the stairwell. The figure in white followed him to the stairs but stopped at the doorway, not entering the stairwell itself. She stood there, perfectly still, facing the camera directly for just a moment. Even through the grainy security footage, Wang could see that her face was wrong, the features blurred or smudged, as if someone had tried to erase them. Then the figure turned and walked back down the corridor, moving out of frame in the direction she had come from. Wang sat back in his chair, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. This wasn't his imagination. This wasn't an acoustic trick or a shadow. This was recorded evidence of something that shouldn't exist, something that had walked behind him through an empty building in the middle of the night. He felt sick, his stomach churning with a combination of fear and disbelief. He fast-forwarded through more of the footage, checking the cameras on the 5th, 6th, and 7th floors. On each floor, the same scene repeated. He would enter the corridor, and moments later the figure in white would appear, following him through his patrol route, always maintaining that same careful distance. On the 7th floor, the top level where he had seen that flicker of movement, the footage showed the figure following him all the way to the far end of the corridor. When he turned back toward the stairwell, she had simply stood there at the opposite end of the hallway, watching him leave. But there was one more piece of footage that Wang knew he had to check, even though every instinct screamed at him not to look. The elevator. There was a single elevator in the building, decommissioned now with its doors locked open, but there was still a camera inside it that covered the elevator lobby on each floor. Wang pulled up the feed from the 4th floor elevator lobby, the timestamp matching when he had been completing his rounds on that floor. The footage showed the elevator doors standing open, the interior dark since the power to the elevator itself had been cut. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the figure in white appeared, walking toward the elevator from the corridor. She moved into the elevator car and stood there facing outward, her features still blurred and indistinct. The doors began to close. Even though the elevator had no power, shouldn't have been able to move at all. As the doors slid shut, the woman raised one hand toward the camera, her fingers splayed in what might have been a wave or a warning. The last thing visible before the doors closed completely was her face, suddenly clear and distinct for just one frame. Her eyes were completely black, no whites visible at all, and her mouth was open far too wide, stretched in an impossible expression that could have been a scream or a smile. Then the doors closed, and the elevator lobby was empty again. Wang stood up so quickly, his chair rolled backward and slammed into the wall. He backed away from the monitors, his breathing coming in short gasps, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He looked at the door leading out of the security office, at the stairs beyond that led up into the building, and he knew with absolute certainty that he could not go back up there. Not tonight, not ever. He grabbed his phone and called his supervisor, a man named Liu, who handled the administrative side of the security company. It was almost 1 a.m, and Liu answered with the groggy irritation of someone woken from sleep. Wang tried to explain what had happened, what he had seen on the cameras, but the words came out jumbled and incoherent. Liu told him to calm down, to speak slowly, to make sense. Wang took a breath and tried again, describing the footsteps, the footage, the figure in white that appeared on every camera. Liu was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, become more serious and less dismissive. He told Wang to stay in the security office, to lock the door, and not go back upstairs under any circumstances. He said he would send someone else to relieve Wang early, that he could leave as soon as the replacement arrived. Wang agreed immediately, relief flooding through him, even though it meant admitting to his supervisor that he was too frightened to do his job. He spent the next 2 hours sitting in that locked office, staring at the monitors, watching the empty corridors where nothing moved. He didn't rewatch the footage. He didn't want to see that figure again, didn't want to confirm that it was real, even though he knew he would never be able to convince himself it had been anything else. When his replacement finally arrived, a younger guard named Chan, who looked at Wang's pale face with concern, Wang grabbed his things and left without explanation. He emerged from the building into the pre-dawn darkness of Sheung Wan, the streets quiet except for early morning delivery trucks and the occasional taxi. The normal world felt impossibly far away, as if he had spent his shift somewhere else entirely, somewhere that operated by different rules. He walked to the nearest bus stop and waited for the first bus of the morning, his hands still shaking, his mind replaying that final image of the woman's face in the elevator, those black eyes and that too wide mouth. When he got home to his subdivided flat, he couldn't sleep. He lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to his neighbors moving around in the adjacent units, the familiar sounds of normal life that suddenly felt precious and fragile. Wang called in sick for his next 3 shifts, something he had never done before in 15 years of security work. His supervisor eventually called him and told him, in a carefully neutral tone, that the building management had decided to hire additional security and that Wang's services would no longer be required at that location. He was being transferred to a residential building in Causeway Bay, day shifts only, if he was interested. Wang accepted immediately. He never went back to the government building in Sheung Wan, never asked what happened to the footage he had seen that night, never spoke about his experience, except once to his ex-wife during an awkward phone call, when she had asked why he seemed so different. She had listened to his story in silence, and when he finished, she told him that her grandmother used to say that old buildings remember things, that some places hold on to the people who pass through them, especially people who die with unfinished business or unresolved pain. Wang didn't know if he believed in such things, but he knew what he had seen, knew that it existed on digital storage somewhere, proof that the world contained phenomena that defied rational explanation. Sometimes late at night, when he couldn't sleep and his mind wandered, he would wonder if the woman in white was still there, still walking those empty corridors, still following security guards on their rounds, visible only to cameras that could capture what the human eye refused to see. And he would feel grateful that he no longer had to find out, that his shifts now took place in sunlit lobbies, filled with ordinary people living ordinary lives, far from the shadows and silence of abandoned places where the dead refuse to rest. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. And while these stories already seem impossible to accept, what comes next takes us even deeper into the places where reality fractures and the unexplainable becomes undeniable. Because when we move beyond empty hospitals and abandoned buildings into the intimate spaces where people live and sleep, where they believe they are safe behind locked doors, the horror becomes far more personal and impossible to escape. The MTR system beneath Hong Kong operated on a schedule that most residents never witnessed. The hours between the last train and the first, when the tunnels fell silent, and the maintenance crews emerged like nocturnal creatures to perform the endless work that kept the system running. Lee Ho Fai had been a cleaner for the MTR Corporation for 11 years, assigned to the night shift crew that worked the Central and Admiralty stations, descending into the tunnels after 2 a.m. when the power was partially cut and the tracks became walkable. It was solitary work, repetitive and physically demanding, but Lee preferred it to the chaos of day shifts where you had to navigate around thousands of commuters and deal with the constant noise and pressure. At 47 years old, divorced with 2 adult children who rarely called, he had settled into a life defined by routine and solitude. The night shift suited him, gave him time alone with his thoughts, and the pay differential for working overnight made a meaningful difference in his modest salary. Tonight was a Wednesday, the 9th of October, and the air in the tunnels carried that particular dampness that spoke of the harbor nearby and the countless tons of earth pressing down from above. Lee worked methodically, his reflective vest bright against the darkness, his headlamp casting a narrow beam of light as he moved along the tracks, collecting debris, wiping down surfaces, checking for any maintenance issues that needed reporting. The Central Line tunnels were relatively new compared to some of the older sections of the MTR network, but they still accumulated an astonishing amount of trash and grime. People dropped things between the platform and the train, coins and receipts and food wrappers, and occasionally more valuable items like phones or jewelry that fell through the gaps. Lee had found thousands of dollars worth of lost property over the years, all of which he dutifully turned in to the lost and found, though he sometimes wondered if anyone ever claimed those items, or if they simply accumulated in some forgotten storage room. His partner tonight was supposed to be Chan, a younger man who usually worked with him, but Chan had called in sick at the last minute, leaving Lee to cover both their sections. It meant more work and a longer shift, but Lee didn't mind particularly. The tunnels were peaceful in their way, removed from the world above, a separate realm where the normal rules seemed suspended. He had been working for about an hour, making his way slowly through the eastbound tunnel between Central and Admiralty, when he first heard the voice. It came through the walkie-talkie clipped to his belt, a burst of static followed by what sounded like sobbing, a woman crying in distress. Lee stopped walking and unclipped the radio, pressing the button to respond. He asked who was on the channel, identifying himself by his employee number, but received only more static and that underlying sound of crying, faint and distant but unmistakably human. The MTR radio system was old and prone to interference, sometimes picking up signals from other frequencies, taxi dispatchers or construction crews, or even baby monitors in the buildings above. Lee had heard strange things over the radio before, conversations that had nothing to do with the MTR, music from unknown sources, once even what sounded like a church service, complete with hymns and prayers. He dismissed the crying as another example of signal bleed, and continued his work, pushing his cleaning cart along the narrow maintenance walkway that ran beside the tracks. But the sound didn't stop. Every few minutes, the radio would crackle to life with that same sobbing, sometimes louder and sometimes softer, but always present. Lee found it increasingly difficult to ignore, the sound worming its way into his concentration, making him pause and listen, even though he knew it was probably nothing more than electromagnetic interference. After the fourth or fifth occurrence, he noticed something else about the sound. It wasn't random or constant. It seemed to be moving, getting louder as if the source was approaching his location, then fading as if moving away. He stopped his cart and stood perfectly still, listening not just to the radio, but to the tunnel around him. The underground space had its own acoustics, sounds traveling in strange ways, bouncing off curved walls and carrying for impossible distances. He heard the usual background noise, the hum of ventilation systems, the drip of water from condensation, the distant rumble of equipment in maintenance rooms. But beneath all that, he thought he could hear something else, an actual voice somewhere in the tunnel with him, separate from the radio transmission. He turned, slowly, his headlamp beam sweeping across the tunnel, illuminating the curved concrete walls, the electrical conduits running along the ceiling, the third rail that carried the power for the trains during operational hours. The beam of his headlamp caught something on the ground about 20 feet behind him, something that definitely hadn't been there moments ago. Footprints. Wet footprints, as if someone had been walking through water and left tracks on the dry concrete of the maintenance walkway. Lee moved closer, his heart rate increasing slightly, though he still maintained his rational perspective. Someone else must be in the tunnel, maybe another maintenance worker or an engineer doing some kind of inspection, though he hadn't been notified of anyone else working this section tonight. The footprints were small, clearly made by a woman's shoe, and they were completely soaked, leaving dark impressions that gleamed in his headlamp light. He followed the trail of prints with his eyes, watching them extend back into the darkness behind him, disappearing into the curve of the tunnel. He called out, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space, asking if anyone was there, if someone needed help. No response came, except for another burst of static from his radio, and this time the sobbing was crystal clear, loud enough that he could make out the ragged breathing between cries, the sound of genuine distress. Lee felt the first real stirring of unease, that instinctive recognition that something wasn't right about this situation. He should report this to the control center, let them know there might be an unauthorized person in the tunnels. But protocol required him to investigate first, if it was safe to do so, to confirm there was actually someone there before calling it in and potentially triggering an emergency response. He began following the footprints, leaving his cleaning cart behind, moving cautiously back the way he had come. The prints led him deeper, into the tunnel, away from the platform at Central Station, heading toward the midpoint between stations where the tunnel curved and descended slightly to pass beneath the foundations of old colonial-era buildings. The sobbing on the radio grew louder the further he walked, no longer intermittent but constant, a steady stream of crying that seemed to match his pace. Lee's unease was shifting into something closer to fear, though he fought to maintain his composure. There had to be a logical explanation. A woman had somehow gotten into the tunnel, perhaps a confused or mentally ill person who had climbed down from the platform after the last train. It happened occasionally. People who were drunk or disturbed, who wandered into restricted areas. She was wet because she had waded through one of the drainage channels that carried runoff water, and the radio was picking up her voice somehow, though Lee couldn't quite work out the mechanism for that. But these explanations felt thin and unconvincing, even as he tried to believe them. The tunnel lights, the emergency lighting that remained on during the maintenance period, began to flicker. It started as brief interruptions, the fluorescent tubes stuttering for a fraction of a second before returning to their normal dim glow. But the flickering increased in frequency until the entire tunnel seemed to pulse with light and darkness. Lee stopped walking, his hand reaching instinctively for the metal railing that ran along the maintenance walkway. The flickering lights created a strobe effect, making movement seem jerky and disconnected, turning the curved tunnel into something from a nightmare. In one of the brief moments of illumination, he saw something ahead of him in the tunnel, a figure standing motionless about 50 feet away. When the lights flickered off and then on again, the figure had moved closer, now perhaps 30 feet away. Lee's rational mind tried to process this. The woman he had been following was ahead of him now, though he hadn't seen her pass him or heard footsteps approaching. She stood facing him, or at least her body was oriented in his direction, but in the unstable lighting he couldn't make out her features clearly. She appeared to be wearing some kind of dress or gown, dark-colored and soaked with water that dripped steadily onto the ground. Her hair hung in wet ropes around her face, obscuring her features. Lee's voice came out rougher than he intended when he called out to her, asking if she was all right, if she needed help. The sobbing on his radio stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete it felt oppressive. The figure didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there in the flickering light like a statue. Lee took a step forward, then another, his training overriding his fear. If this was a person in distress, he had a responsibility to help, to get her out of the tunnel safely before the morning power-up, when the third rail would become lethal again. But with each step he took toward her, the figure seemed to retreat, maintaining the same distance between them, though Lee never actually saw her move. It was as if she existed in separate moments, present in one position when the lights flickered on, then present in a different position the next time, always further away. The wet footprints on the ground multiplied, no longer a single trail, but dozens of overlapping prints, crisscrossing and circling, as if multiple people had been walking through the same space, or one person had walked the same path over and over again. The tunnel lights stopped flickering and went out completely, plunging Lee into absolute darkness except for his headlamp. The beam seemed weaker suddenly, unable to penetrate more than a few feet into the blackness. He panned it across the tunnel, searching for the figure, but saw nothing. The radio on his belt erupted with sound, not crying now, but a voice, words spoken in Cantonese, rapid and desperate. The woman was saying something about being cold, about water, about not being able to breathe, the words tumbling over each other in a panicked stream. Lee's hands fumbled with the radio, trying to respond, trying to ask where she was, but his own voice wouldn't transmit. The radio only broadcast one way, forcing him to listen to the increasingly frantic monologue. Then, as abruptly as it had started, the voice cut off mid-sentence, and the tunnel lights came back on, steady and bright, no flickering. Lee stood in the middle of the tunnel, breathing hard, his headlamp revealing empty space stretching in both directions. The figure was gone, but the wet footprints remained, dark against the concrete, leading forward along the tunnel toward a maintenance door that Lee knew was sealed, marked with warning signs and secured with a padlock. He approached the door slowly, his legs feeling weak and unsteady. The footprints led directly to it and stopped, as if whoever had made them had walked straight through solid metal. The door itself was old, painted industrial gray, marked with faded warnings about electrical hazards and unauthorized access. Lee had walked past it hundreds of times during his shifts, had never paid it much attention beyond noting its existence. But now, standing directly in front of it with those impossible wet footprints leading to its base, the door seemed ominous, a barrier between the normal tunnel and something else entirely. He reached out and touched the metal surface. It was ice cold, far colder than it should have been in the ambient temperature of the tunnel, cold enough that his fingers almost stuck to it. He pulled his hand back quickly and noticed that the padlock, which should have been secured through the hasp, was hanging open, the metal loop pulled free from the lock body. The door was unsecured. Lee knew he should not open it. Every instinct screamed against it, but his hand was already moving to the handle, his curiosity and sense of duty, overriding his fear. He pulled the door open, the hinges protesting with a metallic screech that echoed through the tunnel. Beyond the door was a small maintenance room, barely large enough for 3 or 4 people to stand in. It contained old electrical panels, junction boxes, trailing wires, dusty equipment that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. And water. There was water everywhere, pooling on the floor to a depth of several inches, dripping from the ceiling, running down the walls. The room should have been dry. There was no plumbing here, no reason for water to accumulate in this space. Lee's headlamp beam reflected off the water's surface, creating dancing patterns of light. In the center of the flooded room, just visible beneath the murky water, was an object that Lee couldn't immediately identify. He stepped into the room, the water soaking through his shoes and socks, the cold shocking against his skin. He bent down and reached into the water, his fingers closing, around something fabric, something heavy and waterlogged. He pulled it up, and in the beam of his headlamp he saw what he was holding. It was a dress, a woman's dress, in a dark color, the exact same garment he had seen on the figure in the tunnel. But this dress was old, rotted in places, the fabric falling apart in his hands. As he held it, water poured from the material in a steady stream, far more water than the garment should have been able to hold, as if it were connected to some infinite reservoir. Lee dropped the dress and backed out of the room, his heart hammering so hard he felt dizzy. He turned and ran, abandoning his cart and equipment, his only thought to get out of the tunnel, to reach the platform and the stairs to the surface. He ran faster than he had in years, his lungs burning, his legs pumping, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the walls. Behind him, he thought he could hear other footsteps, that same wet, slapping sound of bare feet on concrete. But he didn't look back, didn't slow down, just ran until he reached the platform at Central Station. He vaulted over the platform edge, his muscles screaming in protest, and collapsed on the tiles, gasping for air. A security guard who had been patrolling the station rushed over, asking what was wrong, what had happened. Lee tried to explain, his words coming out in broken fragments, tunnel and woman and water and footprints. The guard helped him to a bench and called for a supervisor, his expression a mixture of concern and skepticism. When Lee had caught his breath enough to speak coherently, he insisted that they check the maintenance room, that they look at the wet footprints, that they review any security camera footage of the tunnel. The supervisor arrived within 20 minutes, a stern woman named Mrs. Tam, who had been with the MTR for decades and had seen every kind of incident imaginable. She listened to Lee's story with professional calm, taking notes, asking clarifying questions. When he finished, she told him that they would investigate, but that he should go home for the rest of his shift, that he was clearly shaken and needed rest. Lee wanted to protest, wanted to make them understand that something impossible had happened in that tunnel, but he was exhausted and still frightened, and the adrenaline was leaving his system, replaced by a bone-deep fatigue. He agreed to leave, promising to come back the next day to give a full written statement. Mrs. Tam walked him to the staff exit, and as they passed the security monitors, Lee glanced at the screens showing various camera feeds from throughout the station. One of the feeds showed the tunnel he had just fled from, the same stretch of maintenance walkway where he had seen the wet footprints. On the screen, the tunnel looked completely normal, empty and dry, no sign of water or footprints or anything unusual. But as Lee watched, a figure walked across the frame, a woman in a dark dress with long hair obscuring her face, moving with that same gliding motion he had witnessed. She passed directly under a camera, and then she was gone, vanishing between one frame and the next. Lee grabbed Mrs. Tam's arm and pointed at the screen, asking if she had seen it, but the supervisor's expression was confused. She asked what he was talking about. The tunnel was empty. There was nothing there. Lee stared at the monitor, replaying the moment in his mind, certain of what he had seen, but unable to make the supervisor see it too. Mrs. Tam gently guided him toward the exit, her tone becoming more concerned, suggesting that perhaps Lee should see a doctor, that stress and exhaustion could cause hallucinations. Lee let her lead him out, but he knew what he had experienced was real, that the woman in the tunnel was something beyond explanation, beyond the rational world that people like Mrs. Tam inhabited. He never returned to work. He called the next day and quit without explanation, forfeiting his seniority and benefits, accepting the financial hardship that would follow. Some jobs weren't worth the price they demanded. He learned later, through a former coworker who called to check on him, that maintenance crews had found the room behind the sealed door flooded with water, though no one could determine the source. They drained it and sealed the room permanently, welding the door shut, and the wet footprints appeared occasionally on security cameras, always in the same section of tunnel, always leading to that sealed door, footprints that never dried no matter how much time passed, visible to cameras but somehow invisible to the human eye when maintenance crews investigated. The MTR never made any public statement about the incidents, and workers assigned to that section learned to ignore the strange things they saw and heard, accepting them as part of the job, the price of working in the deep places beneath the city where the past refused to remain buried. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The tunnels beneath the city held their secrets, but they weren't the only spaces in Hong Kong where the boundary between the living and the dead seemed dangerously thin. In the hotels that rose into the sky, in the rooms where thousands of travelers came and went, leaving pieces of themselves behind in ways they never imagined, another worker would discover that some guests never truly check out, that some presences linger long after the body has gone, still asking for service, still making their needs known to anyone who will listen. The Harbor Grand Hotel stood 38 stories tall on the Kowloon side of Victoria Harbor, a 4-star establishment that catered primarily to business travelers and tour groups. Its lobby decorated in a style meant to evoke colonial elegance, but that mostly just looked dated and tired. Grace Chung had worked the night shift at the front desk for 2 years, taking the position after dropping out of university when her father fell ill and the family needed her income to cover medical expenses. She was 23 years old, intelligent and ambitious, trapped in a job that paid barely enough to matter but that she couldn't afford to leave. The night shift suited her personality in some ways. She had never been particularly social, and the quiet hours between 11 at night and 7 in the morning, when the lobby was mostly empty, gave her time to study online courses and read, stealing back pieces of the education she had been forced to abandon. The hotel had 1,200 rooms spread across 34 floors, the lower 4 stories occupied by restaurants, meeting rooms, and facilities. The upper floors were standard hotel rooms, differentiated only by their view and their pricing. Rooms ending in numbers 4 and 14 were typically avoided by Chinese guests, due to the linguistic similarity between the word for four and the word for death, so those rooms were usually given to foreign tourists who didn't share the superstition or simply weren't aware of it. Grace had worked enough night shifts to know the rhythms of the hotel, the peak hours when the few late arrivals would check in, the quiet period between 2 and 5 when nothing much happened, the early morning rush as business travelers left for the airport. She knew which elevator had a slightly misaligned door, which ice machine on the 7th floor made a grinding sound, which rooms generated the most complaints about noise or temperature. She had dealt with drunk guests trying to bring strangers to their rooms, credit cards that were declined, couples having loud arguments, medical emergencies requiring ambulances, and once, a minor fire caused by someone smoking in bed. Nothing shocked her anymore. Working the front desk of a large hotel, especially during the night shift, meant encountering humanity at its worst, people away from home and freed from social constraints, treating service staff with a casualness that bordered on contempt. Grace had learned to maintain a professional smile and neutral tone no matter how rude or demanding guests became, had mastered the art of deflecting complaints and managing expectations without ever showing what she actually thought. Tonight was a Tuesday, the 15th of October, and the hotel was running at about 60% occupancy, which was normal for this time of year. Grace had started her shift at 11, relieving the evening receptionist and settling into the familiar routine of checking emails, reviewing the next day's arrivals and departures, and preparing the night audit reports that would need to be completed before her shift ended. The first few hours passed unremarkably, just 2 late check-ins, and a guest calling down to request extra pillows, which Grace arranged to have delivered. It was just past 2 in the morning when the phone rang, the display showing an internal call from room 911. Grace picked up with her standard greeting, asking how she could assist. A woman's voice came through the line, quiet and slightly hoarse, speaking in Cantonese, and asking if housekeeping could bring towels to the room. Grace glanced at her computer screen, pulling up the room information. According to the system, room 911 was marked as vacant, not scheduled to be occupied tonight. She assumed there must be a data entry error, that someone had checked into the room, but the system hadn't been updated properly. It happened occasionally, especially if a guest arrived very late, and the night auditor hadn't completed their rounds yet. She apologized to the caller and said she would send towels up right away, making a note to correct the room status in the system. After hanging up, she called housekeeping, but the night supervisor informed her that the housekeeping staff had already completed their rounds and restocking for the evening, and wouldn't be available again until 6 in the morning. Grace sighed. This meant she would have to deliver the towels herself, leaving the front desk unattended for the few minutes it would take to ride the elevator up to the 9th floor and back. She grabbed a set of fresh towels from the housekeeping closet behind the desk and walked to the elevator bank, pressing the button for the 9th floor. The elevator rose smoothly, the numbers ticking upward on the digital display. Grace used the time to check her phone, scrolling through messages from her younger sister, complaining about their mother's constant criticism. The elevator arrived at the 9th floor with a soft chime, and Grace stepped out into the corridor. The hallway was dimly lit by wall sconces set to their nighttime mode, the carpet absorbing sound and giving everything a muffled quality. Room 911 was located at the far end of the hallway, one of the rooms that many Chinese guests avoided. Grace had never been particularly superstitious herself. Her family attended church, and she had been raised with Christian beliefs that left little room for ghost stories and folk superstitions. But walking down that empty hotel corridor at 2 a.m, she felt a slight unease that she couldn't quite rationalize away. She reached room 911 and knocked gently, not wanting to disturb other guests, and called out softly that she had brought towels. No response came from inside. She knocked again, slightly louder, and identified herself as being from the front desk. Still nothing. Grace frowned and pulled out her master keycard, the one that gave her access to any room in the hotel. She swiped it through the lock mechanism, and the light flashed green with a mechanical click. She pushed the door open a few inches and called out again, announcing herself before entering. The room was completely dark, no lights on, no sound of movement or breathing that would indicate an occupied room. Grace reached around the door frame and found the light switch, flipping it on. The overhead lights illuminated a standard hotel room, one queen bed neatly made with its decorative pillows arranged precisely, a desk and chair, a television mounted on the wall, heavy curtains drawn across the window. The room was empty and, more significantly, it was clearly not being used. There were no personal belongings, no luggage, no sign that any guest had been here. The bed was made with hospital corners, completely undisturbed. The bathroom door stood open, revealing towels already hanging on the racks, toiletries arranged in their standard positions. Grace stood in the doorway, confused and slightly annoyed. Someone had called from this room less than 10 minutes ago. She had clearly seen the room number on the phone display, had heard a woman's voice requesting towels. But the room was obviously vacant, hadn't been occupied tonight, or probably for several nights. She backed out of the room, letting the door close and lock automatically, and walked back to the elevator with the undelivered towels. When she returned to the front desk, she checked the computer system again, looking more carefully at the history for room 911. The most recent occupancy had been 3 months ago, in mid-July. Since then, the room had been marked as out of order, unavailable for booking. There was a note in the system, visible only to hotel staff, that simply read "Maintenance required, long-term hold, do not book, manager authorization needed to release." No explanation for what maintenance was required, or why the room had been held out of service for 3 months. Grace called the assistant manager's extension, even though it was the middle of the night, because something about this situation felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. The assistant manager, a man named David Wong, answered after several rings, his voice thick with sleep. Grace explained what had happened, the call from room 911, the empty room, the long-term hold status. David was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his tone had changed, become more serious and guarded. He told Grace not to worry about it, that if the room called again, she should simply inform them that the number had been dialed in error. He emphasized that she should not go back to the 9th floor tonight, should not enter room 911 again under any circumstances. His unusual emphasis on this instruction made Grace's unease deepen into something closer to fear. She asked why the room was out of service, what had happened there, but David refused to provide details, saying only that it was a management issue and not something she needed to concern herself with. He ended the call abruptly, leaving Grace staring at the phone with growing dread. The rest of her shift proceeded normally for about an hour. She processed some billing corrections, responded to a few emails, tried to focus on the accounting software tutorial she had been working through, but her mind kept returning to room 911, to the woman's voice on the phone, to David's strange reaction when she had mentioned the call. She opened the hotel's staff portal and navigated to the incident reports, searching for any entries related to room 911. The reports were supposed to document any significant problems or events, guest injuries, property damage, complaints that resulted in compensation, anything that might have legal or insurance implications. She found the entry from July 19th, 3 months ago. The report was brief and heavily redacted, with most of the details removed or blacked out, but what remained was enough to make Grace's heart rate accelerate. A guest had died in room 911. The cause of death was listed as suicide. The report noted that the police had been called, statements had been taken, and the family of the deceased had been notified. There were references to cleaning services and biohazard remediation, but all the specific details had been removed. A note at the bottom indicated that the room was to remain out of service indefinitely pending further management review. Grace sat back in her chair, her hands trembling slightly. Someone had killed themselves in room 911, and now that room was calling the front desk asking for towels. She tried to rationalize it, tell herself that it must be a phone system malfunction, crossed wires, or electrical interference that made it appear as if a call was coming from a vacant room. Hotels had complex telecommunications, systems, and glitches were possible, even if improbable. But even as she constructed these logical explanations, she couldn't shake the memory of that voice, the woman speaking Cantonese with that quiet, hoarse tone, asking for such an ordinary thing. At 3:40 in the morning, the phone rang again. Grace stared at it for several seconds before answering, watching the display flash with an internal call designation, room 911. Her hand shook as she picked up the receiver, and for a moment she considered simply not answering, letting it ring until the caller gave up. But her training was too ingrained, her sense of professional obligation too strong. She answered with her standard greeting, though her voice came out strained and unconvincing. The same woman's voice came through the line, but this time it sounded weaker, more distant. She was asking for towels again, saying that she was cold, that she needed towels because she was so cold. Grace's mouth went dry. She tried to speak, to tell the caller that the room was vacant, that no one should be there, but the words caught in her throat. The woman on the phone continued speaking, her words becoming more disjointed and confused. She said she couldn't get warm, that everything was wet, that she had been waiting so long and no one had come. Grace forced herself to respond, to ask who this was, what room she was actually in, but the woman didn't seem to hear the questions. She just kept talking about being cold, about needing towels, her voice fading in and out as if the connection was deteriorating. Then the woman said something that made Grace's blood freeze. She said she couldn't remember her name anymore, that she had been here so long she had forgotten who she was. But she knew she needed towels because she was cold and wet, and someone should have come by now to help her. Grace heard herself saying that she would bring towels, that someone would be there soon. The automatic response coming from some autopilot part of her brain, while the rest of her mind reeled with fear and confusion. The woman's voice brightened slightly, becoming more coherent. She thanked Grace, her politeness somehow more disturbing than her earlier confusion, and then added one more thing before the line went dead. She whispered that it was still happening, that she was still there in the moment, that it never ended, just kept repeating, and she was so tired of being cold. The line clicked and went silent. Grace sat holding the phone receiver, unable to move, her entire body locked in place by terror. She wanted to run out of the hotel, to abandon her post and her job and never come back, but she couldn't make her legs work, couldn't force herself to stand. She placed the receiver back in its cradle with exaggerated care, as if any sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile barriers stood between her and the impossible thing that was happening. She didn't call David again, didn't report the second call, because some part of her understood that this wasn't something management could fix or explain away. This was something else entirely, something that existed outside the normal operations of the hotel, outside the realm of guest services and maintenance issues. Grace spent the remaining hours of her shift in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at every small sound, her eyes constantly darting to the phone, dreading another call that mercifully didn't come. When her relief arrived at 7 in the morning, Grace didn't mention what had happened, didn't try to explain or warn, just gathered her things and left quickly, emerging into the morning sunshine of Kowloon with a desperation that probably looked strange to any observers. She called in sick for her next shift and the shift after that, claiming a stomach flu that required her to stay home. On the third day, David called her personally and asked her to come in for a meeting. His tone made it clear this wasn't optional. Grace went to the hotel at 2 in the afternoon, when the lobby was busy with check-ins and tour groups, when everything felt normal and safe. David met her in a small office behind the front desk, closing the door for privacy. He looked tired, older than she remembered, stress evident in the lines around his eyes. He asked her directly if she had received any more calls from room 911 after their conversation that night. Grace nodded and described the second call, the woman's voice, the things she had said about being cold and wet and trapped in a repeating moment. David listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grim. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands folded on the desk. Finally, he told her something that he said she could never repeat, that if she spoke about it to anyone, he would deny everything and she would lose her job. Grace agreed, desperate to understand what was happening. David explained that the woman who had died in room 911 was a mainland Chinese businesswoman named Wu Mei, 31 years old, who had been staying at the hotel for a 3-day conference. On the second night of her stay, she had filled the bathtub in her room and drowned herself, holding herself underwater until her body's survival reflexes were overwhelmed and her lungs filled with water. She had been found the next morning when housekeeping entered the room after she failed to check out. The bathroom had been flooded, water everywhere, towels soaked and piled around the tub as if she had tried to clean up afterward, though obviously she was already dead. The scene had been disturbing enough that 2 of the housekeeping staff who witnessed it had quit immediately, and the police investigation had been thorough and invasive, turning the room into a crime scene for nearly a week, even though it was clearly suicide with no suspicion of foul play. Since the room had been returned to the hotel's control, there had been problems. Guests who were assigned the room before management took it permanently out of service had complained of strange noises, of feeling watched, of finding the bathroom flooded even though no one had used water. Several guests had checked out early, demanding refunds and threatening to leave negative reviews. And the phone calls had started, always to the front desk, always asking for towels, always in the middle of the night. David had taken some of those calls himself during periods when he covered the night shift. He had heard the voice, the same voice Grace had described, weak and confused and desperately cold. The hotel had tried everything to stop the calls, replacing the phone in room 911, checking the wiring, even bringing in telecommunications technicians to examine the entire system. Nothing worked. The calls continued, unpredictable in their timing, but consistent in their content. Management had decided the simplest solution was to keep the room permanently out of service, to effectively close it and pretend it didn't exist, accepting the lost revenue as a cost of doing business. They couldn't sell the room to guests who would inevitably complain or demand compensation, and they couldn't fix whatever was wrong with it because the problem wasn't mechanical or structural. David told Grace that if she received any more calls from that room, she should simply hang up immediately, not engage in conversation, not promise to send towels or help. The woman was beyond help, existing in some state that defied explanation, trapped in her final moments, and unable to move forward or back. Grace never returned to work at the Harbor Grand Hotel. She sent an email resignation the next day, forfeiting the 2 weeks' notice pay she was entitled to, unable to face the possibility of another night shift, another call from room 911. She found a job at a small cafe in Mongkok, earning less money but working daylight hours, serving coffee to living customers who complained about normal things like temperature and foam consistency. Sometimes at night, lying awake in her small bedroom, she would think about Wu Mei, about what could drive someone to that final desperate act, about the kind of anguish that would persist even after death, leaving an echo that repeated endlessly in a hotel room 9 floors above the street. She wondered if anyone had loved Wu Mei, if anyone had mourned her, or tried to understand what led her to that bathtub. She wondered if the woman's spirit knew she was dead, or if she existed in some confused state where the moment of death just repeated infinitely, always cold, always wet, always waiting for someone to bring towels that would never come, that could never provide the warmth and comfort she needed. Years later, Grace would read an article about the Harbor Grand Hotel being renovated, the older floors completely refurbished with new layouts and modern amenities. She wondered if they had finally demolished room 911, if breaking down the walls and rebuilding the space had freed whatever remained trapped there. But she suspected, in a way she couldn't rationally defend, that some presences couldn't be erased with construction and fresh paint, that Wu Mei was still there in some form, still making calls that only certain people could hear, still asking for something as simple and impossible as a warm towel in the endless cold of her. A final moment. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The last 2 stories we have to share tonight are different from what came before. They're quieter, more intimate, but somehow they cut deeper and stay longer in the memory. Because sometimes the most disturbing encounters aren't the ones that announce themselves with dramatic signs and supernatural displays, but rather the small, almost mundane moments that reveal how thin the barrier really is between our world and whatever lies beyond, waiting patiently for us to notice what has always been there, just out of sight, just beyond understanding, patient and persistent and utterly unavoidable. Lam Chi-kyung had been driving a taxi in Hong Kong for 19 years, ever since he was 25 and needed work that didn't require much formal education or connections. The red Toyota taxi was his own vehicle, purchased through years of careful saving, and he worked the night shift by preference because the roads were less congested and the fares were often better. Late-night travelers from bars and clubs who were too drunk or tired to haggle over routes or complain about traffic. At 44, he was neither married nor particularly interested in changing that status. His life organized around work and the small flat he rented in Kwun Tong, a routine that suited his solitary nature. He knew Hong Kong streets better than most people knew their own apartments, could navigate from anywhere to anywhere without GPS, taking shortcuts through back alleys and knowing exactly when to avoid certain roads due to construction or events. The night shift meant dealing with difficult passengers sometimes, people who were intoxicated or aggressive or who tried to leave without paying. But Lam had developed a thick skin and a calm demeanor that diffused most situations before they escalated. Tonight was a Friday, the 25th of October, and the weather had turned cool and misty, the kind of night where moisture hung in the air without quite becoming rain, making everything slick and reflective under the streetlights. Lam had been driving since 8 in the evening, working his usual route that took him through Central and Wan Chai, occasionally venturing into Kowloon when the fares justified the tunnel toll. It was just past 2 in the morning when he received a call on his taxi radio from a passenger requesting pickup near Victoria Peak, at one of the viewing areas where tourists went during the day to photograph the harbor. It was an unusual location for that time of night. The viewing areas were officially closed after dark, but Lam assumed it was someone whose car had broken down or a couple who had been up there for the view and needed a ride back down. He confirmed the pickup and began the drive up the winding road that led to the peak, his taxi's engine laboring slightly on the steep incline. The road was narrow and poorly lit in sections, flanked by dense vegetation and expensive houses set back from the street, their gates and security systems marking them as belonging to Hong Kong's wealthy elite. When Lam reached the viewing area, his headlights illuminated a woman standing alone near the railing that overlooked the city. She was wearing a simple dress, dark-colored, and had long hair that fell past her shoulders. She stood perfectly still, facing away from the road toward the view, and for a moment, Lam wondered if she had even heard him arrive. He stopped the taxi and left the engine running, stepping out to call to her, asking if she was the one who had called for a taxi. The woman turned slowly, and even in the poor lighting, Lam could see that she was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with delicate features and an expression that seemed sad or distant. She nodded, without speaking, and walked toward the taxi, her movements smooth and unhurried. Lam opened the rear door for her, a courtesy he still observed, despite many passengers not acknowledging or appreciating it, and the woman slid into the back seat without a word. Lam returned to the driver's seat and asked where she needed to go. Her voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, and she gave an address in North Point, a district on Hong Kong Island that would require driving back down from the peak and then across to the eastern side of the island. It was a decent fare, enough to make the trip up the peak worthwhile, so Lam confirmed the destination and began driving. The descent from Victoria Peak was slower than the ascent, the misty conditions making the tight curves treacherous, and Lam took his time, his years of experience making him cautious when visibility was poor. He glanced in the rearview mirror occasionally, catching glimpses of his passenger sitting perfectly still in the back seat, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward the window, though there was little to see in the darkness. She hadn't put on her seatbelt, and Lam considered reminding her but decided against it. Some passengers found such reminders annoying or intrusive, treating them as nagging rather than concern for safety. The radio played softly, a late-night call-in show where people discussed relationship problems and gave advice that was probably worthless but filled the silence. Lam wasn't paying much attention to it, focused on the road and on making good time to North Point so he could get back to busier areas and pick up more fares before his shift ended at 6. As they reached the bottom of the peak and merged onto the main road heading east, Lam tried to make conversation, asking his passenger if she lived in North Point or was visiting someone there. No response came from the back seat. He glanced in the mirror again and saw that she was still staring out the window, her expression unchanged. Some passengers didn't want to talk, and Lam respected that, so he stopped trying and let the silence settle. The drive across the island took about 20 minutes. The roads mostly empty at this hour except for other taxis and the occasional delivery truck. Lam followed the GPS to the exact address in North Point, which turned out to be an older apartment building, probably built in the 70s, with small balconies cluttered with laundry racks and potted plants. He pulled up in front of the building and announced their arrival, pressing the button to unlock the rear doors. He waited for the sound of the door opening, the rustle of movement as his passenger prepared to exit, but heard nothing. Lam turned in his seat to look directly into the back, and his heart stuttered in his chest. The back seat was empty. His passenger was gone. But the seat where she had been sitting was soaked, water pooling on the vinyl upholstery and dripping onto the floor mat, as if Someone had been sitting there in completely soaked clothing, water running off them in streams. Lamb stared at the wet seat, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. He had not heard the door open, had not felt the shift in the car's weight that came when a passenger exited, had not seen any movement in his peripheral vision or mirrors. The woman had simply vanished, leaving behind only water that continued to drip with soft pattering sounds in the quiet of the car. Lamb's hands began to shake, and he realized he was breathing too fast, hyperventilating. He forced himself to take slower breaths, trying to calm the panic rising in his chest. There had to be an explanation. Perhaps she had gotten out very quietly while he wasn't paying attention, perhaps at a traffic light or when he had been checking his phone briefly at a stoplight. But even as he constructed this explanation, he knew it was false. He had been aware of the back seat the entire drive, had checked his mirror regularly, had heard no sounds of movement or departure. And the water, where had that come from? The woman's dress hadn't been noticeably wet when she got in. He would have seen that, would have noticed if she was dripping. Lamb got out of the taxi and opened the rear door, staring at the soaked seat. He touched the water tentatively, and it was cold, ice cold, far colder than it should have been. He looked around the street, searching for any sign of the woman, any indication of where she could have gone. But the sidewalks were empty, the building's entrance dark and locked. He considered going up to the building and pressing random buzzers, asking if anyone had just come home, but what would he say? That a ghost had ridden in his taxi and disappeared? That he had lost a passenger, somehow, between the Peak and North Point? Lamb sat back in the driver's seat, leaving the rear door open, and pulled out his phone. He searched for the address he had just arrived at, typing it into a property database that taxi drivers sometimes use to verify locations or look up information. The search results showed the building's details, and one of the recent news articles linked to the address made Lamb's blood run cold. 10 years ago, almost to the day, a woman named Chen Hui-ling had drowned in her apartment at this address. She had been found in her bathtub by a neighbor who noticed water leaking through the ceiling. The news article included a photograph of Chen Hui-ling, taken from her social media profile, showing a young woman with long dark hair and delicate features, the same woman who had been sitting in Lamb's back seat 20 minutes ago. The article explained that Chen had been suffering from depression following a breakup, and had apparently taken sleeping pills before getting into a bath, where she had lost consciousness and drowned. The police had ruled it an accidental death rather than suicide, but the circumstances were ambiguous enough that speculation continued in the comments section of old news articles. Chen's family had lived in North Point, and she had been returning home from a party on Victoria Peak the night she died, taking a taxi down the mountain in the early hours of the morning. She had arrived home, gone upstairs, and within a few hours was dead. Lamb stared at the photograph on his phone screen, comparing it to his memory of the woman he had picked up. It was definitely the same person, the same face, the same hair, the same sad expression. He had driven a dead woman home, picked her up from the place where her last living journey began, and delivered her to the place where it ended. The water in his back seat was from her drowning, the cold water of death that had filled her lungs and stopped her heart. Lamb felt his stomach lurch, and he barely managed to lean out of the taxi before vomiting onto the street, his body rejecting the impossibility of what had happened through physical purging. He wiped his mouth with a shaking hand and sat there for several minutes, trying to decide what to do. He couldn't call the police. What would he report? That he had unknowingly transported a ghost? They would think he was drunk or mentally ill, would waste his time with questions, and possibly even test him for substances. He couldn't tell his dispatcher what had happened without becoming a laughingstock, or worse, without other drivers refusing to work with him, spreading rumors that his taxi was haunted or cursed. The practical solution was to simply pretend it hadn't happened, to clean the water from his back seat and continue his shift as if this was just another fare, just another night of driving. But Lamb knew he couldn't do that, couldn't unsee what he had seen, couldn't unknow what he now knew. He drove to a 24-hour car wash in Kwun Tong near his flat and paid extra for the interior cleaning service, watching through the window as workers vacuumed and wiped down the back seat, removing all traces of the water that had soaked through. The workers made comments about how wet the seat was, joking about passengers who got caught in rain or spilled drinks, and Lamb nodded along without correcting them, without mentioning that it had been perfectly dry weather all night. When the cleaning was finished and he got back into his taxi, the back seat looked and smelled normal, the chemical scent of cleaning solution covering any other odors. But Lamb couldn't bring himself to pick up any more passengers that night. He drove home, parked his taxi in the street space he rented, and went up to his flat, where he sat on his sofa staring at nothing until the sun came up, and he could hear the normal sounds of the building waking, neighbors starting their days with showers and breakfast and morning routines. Over the following weeks, Lamb tried to return to his normal schedule, driving the night shift and picking up passengers throughout Hong Kong, but he found himself avoiding Victoria Peak, refusing calls that would take him up the mountain, making excuses about mechanical problems or prior commitments when dispatchers tried to assign him fares in that area. Other drivers noticed his changed behavior, his reluctance to take certain routes, his habit of checking the back seat obsessively even when no one was sitting there, but they attributed it to middle-age paranoia or stress. Lamb never picked up another passenger from Victoria Peak, and he sold his taxi 6 months later, taking a significant financial loss, but unable to continue working in a vehicle that carried memories of that night. He found work as a security guard at a shopping center, day shifts only, where the most frightening thing he encountered was teenagers, shoplifting, or elderly people who got lost trying to find the bathrooms. He never spoke about what happened that October night, never shared the story with friends or family. But on the anniversary of Chen Huiling's death, he would sometimes drive past the apartment building in North Point, just to see if anyone was standing outside waiting for a taxi that would never come, a young woman in a dark dress with sad eyes and dripping hair. He never saw her again, but he never stopped looking, never stopped wondering if she was still making that journey from the Peak to North Point, endlessly repeating her final trip home, forever wet with the water of her death, forever asking drivers to take her to an address where she would arrive but never truly return. And sometimes, late at night, when Lam couldn't sleep, he would think about all the other taxi drivers in Hong Kong, all the other people who worked jobs that took them through the city in the dark hours, and he would wonder how many of them had picked up passengers who weren't really there, who had died but didn't know it yet, who were still trying to get home long after home had ceased to exist for them. The city was old and crowded, millions of people layered on top of millions, more who had come before, and perhaps the dead were just another kind of passenger, another kind of customer who needed service, who flagged down taxis and asked politely to be taken somewhere they could never reach, leaving behind only water and confusion, and the knowledge that some journeys never end. They just repeat forever in the spaces between what is real and what refuses to stop being real no matter how much time passes. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. And yet even that encounter, as disturbing as it was, existed within a framework that made some kind of sense, a ghost reliving her final journey, a pattern that could be understood even if it couldn't be explained. But the last story we have to share tonight removes even that small comfort because what happened in a warehouse by the harbor wasn't about the past repeating itself or spirits trapped in old tragedies. It was about something reaching forward, something that saw a living person and decided to make its presence known in the most personal and impossible way, a message that couldn't be ignored or rationalized away, a warning that perhaps we are never the observers we think we are, that sometimes we are the ones being observed, our names already written in places we haven't yet reached. The warehouse complex in Kwaichung had been built in the early 90s to handle the massive volume of goods flowing through Hong Kong's port, a sprawling network of concrete structures holding everything from electronics to textiles to furniture, waiting to be shipped across Asia and beyond. Sheung Wan worked as a forklift operator and general warehouse worker for a logistics company that occupied 3 buildings in the complex, storing inventory for various clients who paid for the space and the security. At 36 years old, Sheung had been doing this kind of work since his early 20s, moving goods and stacking pallets and organizing inventory in the vast, anonymous spaces where global commerce happened out of sight of consumers who never thought about how products moved from factories to stores. He worked the night shift, 10 at night until 6 in the morning, because it paid slightly more, and because he had always been something of a night owl, someone who felt more comfortable working when the world was quiet and dark. The warehouse complex at night was nearly deserted, just a handful of workers scattered across the buildings, each person responsible for their own section and their own tasks, rarely encountering colleagues, except during shift changes or when coordinating movement of particularly large or valuable shipments. Sheung was a methodical person, someone who took pride in efficiency and organization, even though his job was considered low-skilled and replaceable by most people. He kept his section of the warehouse neat, with clear aisles and properly labeled stacks, inventory rotated correctly, and safety protocols followed precisely. His supervisors appreciated his reliability, his tendency to show up on time and complete assigned work without complaint or drama, and they had given him increasing responsibility over the years, making him unofficially in charge of the night crew in Building 2, even though his pay and title didn't reflect this additional authority. He didn't mind. Sheung wasn't particularly ambitious, content with steady work and a paycheck that covered his rent and living expenses, with enough left over for occasional luxuries like new clothes or a nice meal. He lived alone in a subdivided flat in Sham Shui Po, had never married, maintained cordial but distant relationships with his siblings, and generally moved through life without attracting much notice or creating much impact. He was, in most ways, an invisible person, someone whose existence barely registered to those around him, just another body performing necessary but forgettable labor in the machinery of modern commerce. Tonight was a Wednesday, the 30th of October, and Sheung had arrived at his shift to find a notification that a new shipment had come in during the day and needed to be processed and stored before the next morning. The shipment consisted of several pallets of boxed goods, consumer electronics according to the manifest, that needed to be moved from the receiving area and integrated into the existing inventory in his section. It was tedious work, scanning barcodes and updating the computer system and physically moving boxes to their assigned locations, but it was straightforward and gave Sheung something to focus on during the quiet hours. He started working around 11, using the forklift to move pallets and then breaking them down box by box, stacking them according to the warehouse's organizational scheme. The building was cold, the concrete structure offering little insulation, and the heating system was turned down to save energy during the night shift. Sheung wore a heavy jacket over his work uniform, his breath visible in the chilly air, his hands occasionally going numb despite the work gloves he wore. The overhead fluorescent lights created harsh pools of brightness separated by deep shadows, and the sound of the forklift echoed strangely in the cavernous space, bouncing off metal shelving units and stacked cargo. It was around 1 in the morning when Cheng first heard the humming. He had just finished moving a particularly heavy box onto a high shelf and had climbed down from the ladder when the sound reached him, faint and distant, but unmistakably human. Someone was humming a melody, an old song that Chung vaguely recognized as a Cantonese lullaby, the kind of tune that grandmothers sang to children to help them sleep. The melody was simple and repetitive, wandering up and down in a minor key that sounded melancholy even without words. Chung paused, listening carefully, trying to determine where the sound was coming from. His first assumption was that it was Leung, the other night worker who was supposed to be in the adjacent section, perhaps working on inventory and humming to himself to pass the time. It was slightly odd because Leung was generally quiet and not the type to sing or hum, but people did strange things when they thought they were alone. Cheng called out, asking if Leung needed anything, but no response came. The humming continued, steady and unchanging, as if whoever was making the sound hadn't heard him or was too absorbed in the melody to acknowledge him. Cheng felt a flicker of curiosity mixed with slight annoyance. If Leung was going to hum loudly enough to be heard across sections, he could at least respond when called. Cheng walked toward the sound, leaving his work area and moving into the adjacent aisle where the shelving units were taller and stacked with older inventory, goods that had been there for months or longer, waiting for orders that might never come. The lighting was dimmer in this section. Several of the overhead fixtures had burnt out and not been replaced, and shadows stretched between the towering shelves like dark corridors leading into nowhere. The humming grew louder as Cheng walked, the melody filling the space around him, echoing off metal and concrete until it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. He called out again, louder this time, asking who was there, announcing his presence so he wouldn't startle anyone. The humming stopped abruptly, cut off mid-phrase, and the sudden silence was somehow more unsettling than the sound had been. Cheng stood in the dim aisle, listening to his own breathing, waiting for some response or explanation. None came. He pulled out his flashlight, a heavy-duty model that all workers were required to carry, and swept the beam across the shelving units, looking for any sign of movement or presence. The light revealed nothing but boxes and crates, stacked in neat rows according to inventory codes, everything exactly as it should be. Cheng told himself he had imagined the humming, or that it had been coming from outside the building somehow, sound carrying in unexpected ways through the industrial complex. He turned to head back to his work area, but as he did, the humming started again, directly behind him, so close that it felt like someone was standing at his shoulder. Cheng spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, his heart suddenly hammering. There was no one there. The aisle was empty, just shelves and boxes and shadows. But the humming continued, that same lullaby melody, and now Chung could hear that there was something wrong with it, something off about the tune. It repeated the same few phrases over and over, without variation, without breath breaks, without any of the small imperfections that came with human singing. It sounded almost mechanical, as if it were being played from a recording that looped endlessly. Cheng backed away slowly, his flashlight still pointed at the spot where the sound seemed loudest, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was hearing with the absence of any visible source. He considered calling his supervisor, reporting some kind of problem or disturbance, but what would he say? That he heard humming and got scared? That would make him look foolish or unstable, might even cost him his job if they decided he was creating problems or drama. He decided to check if Leung was in his designated work area, to confirm that the other man was where he was supposed to be and not wandering around the warehouse humming to himself. Cheng walked quickly through the connecting passages between sections, his footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. When he reached Leung's area, he found the other man exactly where he should be, working on inventory counts with his tablet, completely absorbed in his task. Cheng asked if Leung had been humming or singing at any point in the past hour. Leung looked up with confusion, saying no, he had been working in silence. Why? Cheng mumbled something about hearing strange sounds and returned to his own section, his unease growing into something closer to fear. If it wasn't Leung, then who or what had been making that sound? The warehouse complex was supposed to be secure, locked and alarmed, with only authorized personnel having access. But perhaps someone had found a way in. Perhaps a homeless person looking for shelter or a thief casing the building for valuable goods to steal. Cheng decided he should do a more thorough check of his section, make sure all the emergency exits were secure and that there were no signs of unauthorized entry. He moved systematically through the aisles, checking doors and windows, examining the spaces between shelving units for any indication that someone was hiding there. Everything appeared normal and secure. Nothing out of place. No evidence of intrusion. The humming had stopped again, and Cheng began to convince himself that he had somehow misheard something innocuous, his tired brain interpreting random mechanical sounds as a human voice. He returned to the shipment he had been processing, determined to finish the work and stop letting his imagination create problems that didn't exist. He picked up the next box, scanned its barcode, and looked at the screen on his tablet to see where it needed to be stored. The screen displayed the inventory information, showing the product description, quantity, and storage location. But beneath that, where the shipper's name should have been listed, Cheng saw something that made his hands go weak, almost dropping the box. The shipper's name field read Sheung Wan, his own name, his full name exactly as it appeared on his identity card. He stared at the screen, blinking hard, thinking it must be a visual artifact or a system glitch. He refreshed the screen, rescanning the barcode, but the information remained the same. The box was supposedly shipped from someone named Cheng Man. Cheng set the box down carefully and picked up another one from the pallet, scanning it with hands that were now trembling noticeably. The same information appeared on the tablet screen. Shipper name Cheng Man. He tried a third box, then a fourth, each time seeing his own name staring back at him from the screen. This was impossible, made no sense according to any logic he could conceive. These boxes had come from a supplier in Shenzhen. The manifest clearly showed the company name and contact information. There was no reason for his name to appear anywhere in the shipping data. Cheng examined the physical boxes themselves, looking at the labels printed on their sides. The labels showed the standard information, product codes, destination addresses, handling instructions. But, in small print near the bottom of each label, almost too small to read in the prompts, dim warehouse light, was a name field. And every single label read Cheng Man. Every box on the pallet, dozens of them, all labeled with his name in a place where that name should never appear. Cheng felt reality tilt around him, the familiar warehouse suddenly becoming alien and threatening. He walked away from the pallet, moving into the next aisle where older inventory was stored, boxes that had been there for weeks or months. He randomly selected a box from a high shelf and pulled it down, examining its label. Cheng Man. Another box from a different shelf. Cheng Man. A crate from the floor level. Cheng Man. Everywhere he looked, every box he examined, they all bore his name in that small print field, labels that he knew for a fact had been there long before tonight, before this shift, before he had even started working at this warehouse. But now they all said the same thing, announcing his name over and over in endless repetition, as if the entire warehouse had been waiting for him, as if all these goods had always been intended for him or from him or about him in some way that defied understanding. Cheng's breathing became rapid and shallow, panic rising in his chest like a physical pressure. He pulled out his phone and took photographs of the labels, needing to document this impossible thing, to prove to himself that he wasn't hallucinating or losing his mind. The photographs showed exactly what he was seeing, his name printed on labels in multiple fonts and sizes, some crisp and new, some faded and weathered, but all legible, all reading Sheung Wan Man. He thought about showing the photographs to Leung, about calling his supervisor, about doing something to break the isolation and share this experience with another human being who could confirm or deny what was happening. But even as he considered these options, he knew he wouldn't follow through with them. This was something that was happening to him specifically, something personal and targeted that others probably couldn't see or wouldn't see even if they looked directly at it. The humming started again, and this time Cheng recognized it for what it was. Not a lullaby meant to comfort or soothe, but a lullaby sung for someone who was dying. The kind of song that marked transitions and endings. The melody surrounded him, filling the warehouse with its melancholy repetition, and Chung understood with sudden clarity that he was in danger, that something in this place had marked him, had written his name on reality itself, in preparation for something he couldn't comprehend. He ran toward the exit, abandoning his post and his responsibilities, his only thought to get out of the building, to put distance between himself and whatever presence inhabited this space. He reached the security door and swiped his access card, but the light flashed red and the lock didn't open. He tried again, then again, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the card steady. The system should have worked. His card was active and authorized. There was no reason for it to fail. He pounded on the door, shouting for help, hoping that security guards or other workers might hear him, but no response came. The building swallowed his voice, absorbed his panic without acknowledgement. Behind him, the humming grew louder, no longer distant, but close, as if invisible mouths were opening in the air around him, all humming that same endless tune. Cheng turned from the door and ran deeper into the warehouse, abandoning logic in favor of pure animal flight instinct. He ran through aisles and between shelving units, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly, creating disorienting patterns of light and shadow. Everywhere he looked, he saw his name on boxes, on crates, on pallets, printed and handwritten and stamped. His identity repeated thousands of times in this space dedicated to anonymous commerce. He realized he was crying, tears running down his face without any conscious decision to cry, his body responding to a terror that his mind couldn't fully process. He found himself back in the receiving area where he had started the shift hours ago, the space now feeling like a trap rather than a workplace. The humming stopped once more, and in the sudden silence Cheng heard something else, a voice speaking his name, calling him with the inflection of someone trying to wake a sleeping person. "Sheung Wan Man," the voice said gently, almost lovingly. "Sheung Wan Man, wake up. It's time to wake up." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, male and female and neither, familiar and completely alien. Cheng pressed himself against a wall, his eyes squeezed shut, his hands covering his ears in a futile attempt to block out the sound. The voice continued, patient and persistent, telling him that he needed to wake up, that he had been asleep for so long that it was time to remember who he was and where he belonged. When Cheng finally opened his eyes, the warehouse was different. The shelving units were in the same positions, the layout unchanged, but everything looked faded and indistinct, as if he were seeing it through dirty glass or thick fog. The boxes no longer had labels at all, just blank surfaces that somehow still communicated his name, the letters forming in his mind without needing to be seen. And standing at the far end of the receiving area, barely visible in the uncertain light, was a figure. It was shaped like a person, roughly human in proportion, but its features were wrong or absent, as if someone had tried to sculpt a human form from memory and gotten the details confused. The figure raised one hand in a gesture that could have been a wave or a beckoning or a warning. Cheng stared at it, unable to move or speak, his voice locked in his throat. The figure began to walk toward him, not threateningly, but purposefully, each step bringing it closer while somehow never changing its apparent distance. Cheng's paralysis broke, and he stumbled backward, away from the figure, back into the maze of aisles and inventory. He ran without direction or plan, just desperate movement through space that seemed to be collapsing around him, aisles that went nowhere and connected to themselves, shelves that multiplied and merged until the warehouse became an impossible labyrinth with him trapped at its center. How long he ran, Cheng couldn't have said. Time stopped having meaning. Just an endless present moment of fear and flight, and his own name echoing from every surface. When he finally stopped, exhausted beyond capacity to continue, he found himself back at the original pallet of boxes he had been processing when this nightmare began. The boxes sat there innocently, waiting to be scanned and stored, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Cheng looked at his watch and saw that only 20 minutes had passed since he had first heard the humming, though it felt like hours had elapsed. He checked his phone and saw that the photographs he had taken were gone, the gallery showing images from days ago but nothing from tonight. He examined the boxes with shaking hands, pulling them close to his flashlight to read the labels. The labels showed normal information, company names and product codes and shipping dates. His name appeared nowhere. Everything was exactly as it should have been, as it had always been, with no evidence that anything strange had ever happened. Cheng stood in the familiar warehouse space, surrounded by familiar objects, and knew with absolute certainty that he could not stay here, could not continue working in this place where reality had briefly shown him something underneath its surface, something that knew his name and had been calling to him from boxes and voices in the spaces between things. He left immediately, not even collecting his belongings from the break room, just walking out through the security exit that opened normally when he swiped his card. The night air was cold and damp, and Cheng stood in the parking lot, taking deep breaths, feeling the reality of the outside world anchor him back to normalcy. He called his supervisor from his car and quit over the phone, citing family emergency and inability to continue working night shifts, apologizing for the lack of notice, but firm in his decision. The supervisor was annoyed, but accepted the resignation, too tired himself to argue or try to convince Cheng to reconsider. Cheng drove home as the sun was beginning to rise, painting the Hong Kong skyline in shades of orange and pink, the city waking to another ordinary day. He never spoke about what happened that night, never tried to explain or make sense of it, just accepted it as an experience that existed outside the boundaries of explanation. He found new work eventually, day shifts in a small shop that sold hardware and building supplies, a place with windows and other people, and no dark aisles where things could watch him unseen. But sometimes, even years later, he would be sorting inventory or stocking shelves, and would suddenly notice his name written somewhere it shouldn't be, a product label or a receipt or a handwritten note that somehow bore his full name in circumstances that made no logical sense. And when that happened, he would hear that humming again, faint and distant but unmistakable, the lullaby that marked endings and transitions, and he would know that whatever had called to him in that warehouse was still aware of him, still watching, still waiting patiently for the moment when he would finally understand what it had been trying to tell him, what his name written everywhere had been trying to make him remember. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.